The god's wood of the Red Keep held no heart tree. It was all soft leaves and carved paths and a mirror-dark pool that caught the lantern glow and turned it into a trembling ribbon of fire. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city still clattered. Cartwheels on cobbles, drunk laughter, dogs barking at the moon. A breeze found its way in from the Blackwater and brought with it the smell of tar and fish and warm stone. Eddard Stark listened to that, the life of a place that was not his, and felt the ache in his leg as the ache of everything he had brought here and could not keep. Yoren waited in the shadows, lean against an elm trunk, a knotted man carved of road dust and old winter. The black cloak hung off his thin shoulders in greasy folds. His hair looked like it had been cut with a dirk, or perhaps torn out in handfuls. He seemed a part of the night, and across the pool his eyes had that glint that belongs to wolves and ferrymen and men who stand between one world and another. "You're certain?" Yoren said, voice low and rough. "There'll be searching. Dogs. Gold cloaks nosing in every sack." "I am not asking you," Ned said. "I am trusting you." Yoren spat in the grass. "I prefer dogs to promises." Yet he took the small pouch Ned offered him and the folded parchment sealed with a smear of plain wax. He did not glance inside. He tucked them both somewhere within the folds of his cloak. "Two girls. My daughters," Ned said. The words sat in the air like a choice he could not unsay. "I want them out of the city before dawn, through the river gate with your recruits. No names, no looks back. When you reach the neck, there will be crannogmen who answer to Howland Reed. They'll know what to do." Yoren's mouth made the shape of a grin and didn't quite get there. "That swampy father of frogs? I remember his spear. It's not a man's, that one, but he fights like he never heard of dying." He hooked a thumb toward the keep. "They'll come after them, Stark. The pretty one especially. That queen. She likes her hostages soft and sweet." Ned closed his eyes. The scent of damp earth rose from the pool, and under it, the faint iron tang that lived in his leg now. "I know." In his mind he saw Sansa's face when he told her they would be going. He saw Arya's, too fair as a streak of smoke, more wolf than lamb, more wind than girl. "Cut their hair if you must. Smear them with filth. Keep them from heroics and from pride. Bring them home." "Home," Yoren said, as if the sound of the word was something to test on his tongue. "And the payment?" "You have it," Ned said, though both men knew Yoren wasn't asking about coin. "And more if the gods are kind." The recruit collector's dark gaze flicked past Ned, to the slender fruit trees, the pool, the pale lamps. "Gods aren't kind," he said, "but they are stubborn." He pushed off the elm trunk. "Rouse them quiet. I know a way down from the Tower of the Hand where the watch don't watch, if you take my meaning. I'll have them on the move before your queen wakes to her schemes." Ned's hand went to the hilt he could not use without pain and found it anyway. "You are taking a great risk." "I'm old," Yoren said, amused by something only he could see. "The years have made my fear thin." He shifted the black cloak, and for a heartbeat Ned glimpsed a hard old blade under the ragged hem. "There's a river in me, hand. North is the way it runs." The Godswood's lanterns swayed. In their quivering light, Yoren was already receding into the leaves. "Keep your leg from foolishness," he said. "I'll keep the girls from the same." When the night's watchman was gone, Ned sat by the pool and listened to the city rattle and hiss on its own breath. He thought of trees that bled sap like tears and snow that made a hush as great as prayer. He thought of a winter wolf who had died by the king's command because a prince had lied, and the memory pushed up through his ribs like an old wound breaking open. He set his jaw against it. "The pack survives," he told the shallow reflections in the pool, and the pool trembled and did not disagree. In the girls' chamber the air smelled of the rose oil Sansa loved and the old leather of Arya's boots. Septa Mordain had stopped scolding after midnight and gone to her pallet with the sigh she used when she had done all that could be done and the world refused to become sensible. Jane Poole had curled under the coverlet and cried for her father until the crying made way for sleep. In the corner sat a wooden chest with a pink ribbon tied round its middle, overflowing with things that were not treasures and so needed to be called that until they were. Sansa woke first to the press of a rough hand, and when she opened her eyes and saw the man in black and the knife in his hair and the blunt face, she made to scream, then remembered to be brave because brave was beautiful when done without flinching. Yoren's palm slid over her mouth and took the scream into the skin of him and gave it back as a whisper. "Hush now," he said. "No harm. Your Lord Father sent me. On your feet. Leave the pretty." Arya woke with a snort and had a blade in hand before her eyes were fully open. It was only a little blade. Needle had a better name than size, but Yoren's head tilted in the way men have when they see in a child the hint of the wolf that made her. "Good," he said to Arya like a teacher said a task. "Now put it away where men won't go looking for it." "What for?" Arya asked at once, and that question in her mouth had sharp edges. "Where are we going?" "North," Yoren said, as if that were answer enough. "Get into that." He held out a rough-spun tunic that looked like it had been dragged behind a mule through a puddle. The color might once have been brown or perhaps green, the way river water is both and none. He tossed another to Sansa, then a cap with a cut-down brim. Sansa stared at the tunic as though it were a joke told poorly. "That smells," she said. "Oh, Arya," because Arya would laugh and they would be the girls they had been yesterday, for as long as it took to laugh. "It's supposed to," Yoren said. "No one looks close at a stink." "My father," Sansa began, and she heard the plea in it and hated herself, but Yoren only nodded as if it was a thing he had already counted. "Aye." Septa Mordane's breath rasped in the corner and turned, without waking, into a prayer. Jane Poole murmured something about dancing and handsome boys and fell deeper into the dark. Sansa pulled the rough spun over her linen shift and felt the coarse weave scrape the softness of her skin. She tried to keep her chin high as she did it. She kept the ribbon in her hair but tucked it under the cap because that was a compromise and she had always been good at those. "Mother says it's not fit to leave without taking leave," Sansa said, because good girls said the things their mothers had taught them at the moments when their mouths went searching for something to say. "Your mother's too far to hear it," Yoren said. He set the cap on Arya's head, then paused, grimacing. "No, that will not pass. Come." He drew his knife. "Hold still." Arya held still. Her mouth made a tight line. The knife worked through her hair with a dull, sawing sound, and brown fell in chaff across her shoulders and down like the last of the tarnished leaves shaken from a tree. She did not blink until it was done, and then she breathed out, and the breath had a shiver in it that Ned would have known was not fear but fury made small and manageable. Sansa lifted a hand to her own hair before she could stop herself. "Please," she said. "Not mine. Please." She had been told her hair was lovely since she was 4. Men and women both had said it, and the words had covered her like honey. She knew what she was asking and what it meant, and she asked anyway. Yoren studied her. "No," he said finally. "We'll keep it under the cap. That face of yours will be more trouble. Don't look at men. Don't walk like a lady. And don't open that mouth of yours for a call, no matter who you see. Do it right, and even the Hound won't see you for what you are." "The Hound," Sansa said, the name like a door then, opening on a hall of sunlight and cruel grins and a boy with hair like a lordling in a song. "Does J—" She caught herself on the edge of the letter and gulped the last of it down. Arya's eyes flicked to her, quick and cutting. "Boots," Yoren said. "Cloaks. We've got a little time before the cock's first crow. Not much more." They left the chamber like the shadows of themselves. Sansa cast one glance back because the impulse to do so was bones deep, and in that glance she saw the small pink ribbon mounded on the floor where it had fallen in their fumbling. A petal shed by a flower no one would admit had been cut. She left it. She did not leave without taking leave. In her head she whispered to Septa Mordane that she would be good, that she was always good, that she would be perfect enough to balance this wrongness. She whispered to Jane that she would find a way to write from Winterfell and that there were so many more dances yet to dance. She whispered to a wolf that had no ears to hear anymore, and that was the whisper that hurt. Yoren led them through corridors that smelled of old stone and recent smoke, down staircases whose edges had been worn concave by the feet of men who'd run to or from their own moments of choice. At a door the color of tallow, He took out a ring of keys and found one that looked as if it had been filed to within a breath of snapping and worked it into the lock. The door opened on a passage like a throat. The girls ducked inside. They climbed out into a courtyard where a single cart waited with its shafts resting on the ground like a tired man's arms. A mule blinked, considered, and decided not to care. 3 boys and a sullen man at least 30 stood around the cart and looked away from Ned's daughters because they had been told they were not seeing anything unusual. One boy had hair too long and a round, honest face. He would tell any secret he was given. Another had narrow eyes and the air of a gutter rat who'd learned to see value in ditch water. The third was taller than the others, built like a smith's apprentice, with arms like tree boughs and a face that would be handsome when it stopped being so surprised at the world. On the cart, bundled in canvas and nettles, lay 6 more souls and their share of luck. "Here we are," Yoren said, as if the night were a place, not a time. "Up." Sansa climbed into the cart and found herself on a sack of barley that pricked through the rough cloth and made her think of Winterfell's granaries and of her mother counting sacks with her hands behind her back. Arya planted herself on the boards and scowled at anyone who got near her, the cap low and the eyes bright. Yoren made a show of adjusting ropes and kicking wheels and swatting the mule as he stepped into the traces. "Hop," he said to the beast, and the beast obeyed with all the speed of a sermon. They went out by the river gate, and the guards did not look hard because the night's watch in the small hours was as common as cats in alleys. Still, one gold cloak moved toward them and set a hand on the cart and squinted into its pile of limbs and sacks and lives. His breath smelled of onions. "Got more than boys there," he said, suspicion grinning out from behind his teeth. Yoren put his staff up under the man's wrist and pressed. It was friendly until it wasn't. "We got what we got," he said, and the man felt in that moment what it was to be a salmon in the hand of a fisherman. He stepped back because there were places in the world where men were as simple as cattle and there were places where it was wiser to be clever. "Go on then," the guard muttered. The portcullis shuddered and rose. The city receded as slowly as a nightmare when the dreamer wants to be done with it. The stinks of fish and men and fires became a memory. They ate the edge of the night and then the rim of the dawn, and by the time the first light ran along the carts of the peddlers headed south, they were just another piece of the road. The King's Road north was a line scratched by gods or kings on the green of the land, straight as a thought men don't dare question. It ran past hedgerows and orchards and fields where short, bowed men with brown faces turned to watch the cart rattle by. It ran through hamlets that had the names of saints and old kings and ghosts. It ran, and Yoren ran with it, the mule clopping in a rhythm that became the beat of Sansa's heart when she grew tired of thinking. "Don't talk," Yoren said on the second day when the round-faced boy tried to ask Sansa where she had gotten hands with no scars. "Names are a kind of rope. Don't give anyone one end." Arya took to the road the way a duck takes to water, as if she had been built for it and someone had only just remembered. She learned to hold a crust of bread and a strip of dried meat in one hand and eat both without losing more than a bite to crumbs. She learned to pee behind a hedge with the speed of a boy who understands that being caught makes trouble. She learned to sleep with one hand on the hilt of needle tucked deep in her tunic. When the tall boy with the smith's shoulders looked at her blade with a glimmer of interest, she looked back with the coolness of winter water. "It's a needle," she said. "It's a sword," the boy said, his mouth fearing the word and saying it anyway. "Not to you," Arya said, and that was that. Sansa learned, too, though the learning tasted of humbling and of grit. She learned to walk without gliding and to lower her head without seeming to yield. She learned to smile without teeth and to use her eyes without inviting more. She learned that sometimes the smell of a thing was not the worst of it. Sometimes the way people looked at you while you wore the stink was worse. She learned that courtesy could be a shield on the road as it had been at court, if she could wield it with less lace and more leather. On the third evening a small rain fell and then stopped with a sigh, and the air seemed combed. They camped near a stand of birch trees, their leaves like fish scales, their bark ghost pale in the shadows. Yoren chewed a strip of leather mess that might have once been beef and considered the black line of the road like a man eyeing a river before he puts in. "They'll know by now," he said, to no one in particular. The queen will have her birds in the air. The spider will have his, though I don't know which ones bite and which ones sing. He spat. We keep to hedges. We don't linger. And no one lights a fire for pretty. Sansa remembered then the weight of her father's hand on her hair the day he had told her they were going to King's Landing. How her heart had climbed like a song onto his words and perched there, propriety gone shy before wonder. She remembered the way Lady had leaned against her knee as if the world could be made safe by the press of a wolf. It hurt to remember. It hurt in a useful way, the way a stitch hurts when you tug it so the wound will close clean. She woke in the night to a sound she did not recognize, a kind of quick laughter on feet. It was only when she was entirely awake that she knew. Wolves far off, the call bouncing between clumps of trees. Arya was awake already and sitting, knees drawn up, eyes glittering with the sound. Nymeria, Arya whispered, into the dark as if the name could hunt. Sansa did not say Lady's name. There are names you guard because they are all you have left. On the 7th day they reached the inn at the crossroads, the riverbent building that had seen more bargains than any September. The walls slumped a little with the weight of the stories they held. The yard smelled of old straw and spilled ale and horse. The woman at the door had teeth stained by some leaf she loved more than they loved her. And when Yoren showed his black cloak, she sketched a sign of the 7 and waved them into the common room with a face that said money first and everything else after. They ate porridge with little bits of salt pork in it and drank small beer that tasted like barley moving in a cup. Sansa kept her head down and her cap low and chewed and swallowed and tried not to listen to the talk about riders on the road with lion badges on their chests and the talk about a stable boy who'd had his throat opened for whistling at the wrong moment. The round-faced boy counted peas in his bowl aloud until Arya kicked him under the table. Quiet, Arya hissed. The boy, Hot Pie by nickname and destiny, stuck his lower lip out like a dog that had been abandoned by everyone but hunger. The door blew open on a gust and let in a clutch of gold cloaks with the chill of river air around their boots. The room grew smaller by half. Yoren did not move. He had a stillness that pulled the eyes to him without seeming to. Night's watch, the leader of the gold cloaks said in the tone a man uses when he means to say nuisance and says something else because it serves him. He had a thin scar across his nose that made his expression look sharper than it might have been. We're looking for 2 girls. Yoren leaned back and let the bench creak. We got boys, he said mildly. All kinds. 2 maidens, the gold cloak said. Dark hair and fair. One's a wolf with a temper. The other's a dove with a taste for crowns. His companions laughed, and the sound scraped the room like a blade against the grain of a table. Sansa did not look up. She pressed her knees together and folded her hands on the table and counted breaths. One of the recruits, a skinny lad with straw in his hair and chip-coin eyes, was looking straight at her, his curiosity like a candle cupped in his palms. She let her back soften and her belly puff a little and let her shoulders sag. She had learned, too, that to be unseen you sometimes chose to be less. The tall boy with the smith's arms set his bowl down hard enough to slop porridge. His jaw had that stubbornness to it that meant he would move or he would make the world move to him. The gold cloak with the scar noticed it. You, the man said, pointing. What's your name? Gendry, the boy said, because he had a way of speaking that made lying hurt his mouth. Stand up, the guard said. He circled the boy, eyes on the breadth of shoulder, the way the wrists rolled. You belong to a master. Used to, Gendry said. He let me go to take the black. Did he? The gold cloak said, almost amused. Men don't let go of arms like yours. Yoren rose in a pull of cloak. The watch takes what it will, he said. He did not raise his voice, but the words made a space in the room. By right as old as kings. He looked at Sansa without looking, the way an old hound marks a rabbit by the shift of grass. Eat up, he said to the boys. We'll be on the road before you can think of what you're missing. The gold cloaks lingered, eyes snagging on faces and then slipping off them like hands trying to catch fish. The scarred one turned eventually, half his mind already on the next face he'd have to make prove itself true. His men followed. The door banged and the cold came in again and then it closed. Move, Yoren said. He didn't have to say it twice. They left by the yard, slipped into the bones of the hedges, and were a piece of landscape by the time the stable boys realized the mule was not in the stall and began to shout for a master who did not care. The road was wet and took feet like memory. If there were riders behind them, Yoren set a pace that made those riders decide they had other business. The coup came like a storm that had gathered out beyond the sea for years and found land in an hour. It broke over the Red Keep and spilled down into the city, and the city lapped it up. Ned walked with men who had fought in the alleys and in the north and in places south of this where the air itself tried to turn your sword. He walked with the city watch that was meant to be his because he had bought it with honor and gold, and he did not glance often at Littlefinger because a wise man does not look too long at his own hesitation. When the swords flashed in the throne room, they were as bright and brief as fish. The crown was a circle that made an emptiness under it when no one wore it. Cersei's green eyes glittered from the foot of the steps. The boy with the hound's shadow beside him stood with his head high to make himself taller, and the world bent to him because the world liked to bend to golden boys even when bending cracked the spine of it. Varys's silk whisper moved in the air like another man's breath, unowned and insistent. Ned made the choice he had made long ago when he chose what kind of father he would be, what kind of lord, and he put words behind it and they did not save him. The city watch showed him what gold buys when it buys a promise. By sundown, ravens knew things men did not yet know about themselves. That night the queen sent riders to all 8 gates and along every road like fingers closing in on a purse. Somewhere in the rout of alleys and rooftops, men gathered outside a small, pious house with shutters painted a cheerful blue and dragged a woman with a stern mouth and soft hands into the street because a little bird had told them stern mouths made good examples. The cry of a septa is a song few men want to hear twice. Jane Poole woke later to a blade in a different hand and a different kind of mercy. On the road, Sansa did not hear any of that. She heard only the whine of the cart, the whispering hush of the hedgerows, and Yoren's curses, which were creative in ways that would have made Septa Mordain swoon. The sky had gone gray and low and spat at them. Around mid-morning, the hound's riders found the inn where Sansa had set a bowl on a table and cut the word Gendry into halves by the weight of it. The riders found the stale smell of porridge and nothing worth the telling. They went out onto the road with lion badges bright on their chests and ran north with a hunger in them that had some pride and some fear threaded through it. At dusk, the gold cloaks found them. Yoren saw them from the lip of a shallow ditch where the road dipped and then climbed again. The thread of men and horses like a line on a map no one wanted drawn. "Here," he said, and forced the mule down into scrub. "Off the road. Get to trees. Quiet as mice with hawks above." The boys tumbled out, old boots slipping in mud, arms full of bundles that seemed less theirs now than the roads, faces full of an alert panic that made them sharp and clumsy by turns. Sansa slid down the bank and caught herself with her hands, and the mud took her palms and held them in a way that made her think of vows. Arya was ahead of her, face close to the earth, the cap at the angle of a boy who doesn't care what he looks like. The riders crested the road. Yoren stood in their way as a tree stands, unmovable and uninteresting until a man cracks his head against it. The scar-nosed guard led them again. His horse snorted. "We'll have the boy," the man said, flat, and his gaze swung to Sansa and the moment felt like an eye blinking in slow time. It moved on. "2 girls, then, if you'd not give the boy. The Queen's word on it." "The Queen's word is wind," Yoren said. He leaned on his staff like it was all that kept him upright, and the staff had the marks of many roads and a few skulls on it. "My word is ice. The watch takes what it will. You're in my way." The guard laughed. "Your way? What do you know of ways, old man? We make the way." He flicked 2 fingers, and his men began to fan. "Back?" Yoren said over his shoulder without seeming to speak. "Girls, back." Sansa looked around for something that might be a back and saw only trees with trunks too slim. Dur to hide behind and a stand of thorn that looked like a cousin of the crown men were ready to kill each other over. Arya had disappeared. Sansa could not hear her feet. She could feel her. It was as if the little sister had become the breath the wood held and the small twitch between leaves. The boys with them were animals caught between snarling and bolting. The round-faced one, Hot Pie, hissed and whimpered and picked up a stone, and then put it down and then picked it up again as if the stone mattered more to him than any oath did. Gendry stepped forward, not in front of Yoren but behind him in a way that made him a wall without bragging. "No," Sansa said suddenly, and she didn't know what she was saying no to until she had said it. She tasted fear like metal. "Please," she said, looking up with her eyes the way she had been taught, which was to show sincerity and conceal pride. "If you are sworn to the king, and I am sure you are, then you know the vows sworn to the Watch. The 7 sea men who break them. The old gods see longer." The scar-nosed guard made a sound that might have been contempt or might have been established caution. "Pretty manners," he said. "The queen wants wolves for collars and boys that belong to smiths. Give them, and I don't make this road red." Yoren's staff jumped. It was so fast it did not look like a thing an old man could do. It cracked the guard under the chin and spilled him back in the saddle in a spray of spit and blood. The horse screamed. The road erupted. What followed was noise shaped into fate. The gold cloaks fell forward in a rush made of the memory of other rushes. Yoren's staff found wrists, knees, throats. Gendry had a hammer in his hands, though no one had seen him take it up. It had lived under a cloth in the cart, meant for another day when a man would need iron made soft. It made a sound when it found bone. Hot pie through the stone he had been arguing with and hit a rider's cheek and then stood blinking as if surprised that anything he did had weight. Sansa slid sideways and felt the thorn bite her through the cloak, and the bite gave her something that felt like permission. She found a branch and held it low and braced and swung it up under a mount's knees. The horse stumbled and went down, and the rider went flying with a curse that lost its last word when it hit a tree. Arya flowed out of the green and came at a man from behind, thrusting needle in low, the way Syrio had taught her to stab the soft places that do not look like places. The blade went in. It did not go in far. The man bellowed and turned, and Arya was already back in shadow, breath fast, eyes wide and dark and alive. Took only a heartbeat too long. Yoren's staff arced, then shattered under a braced sword and left him holding splinters and stubbornness. He snarled. The sound seemed too big for his chest. He took a blade on his forearm and the blood came slick and hot. He drove what was left of the staff up under a rider's ribs and then used the body as a shield until the shield fell. "Run," he said. Or perhaps he only meant to say it and the sound pushed out of him as something like a cough. "Run!" They ran. The scrub caught them and held and then let go like a mother who hated what she knew had to be done. The ditch took Sansa down to her knees and then pulled her back up. Arya did not seem to touch the ground. Gendry came last, twisting to see if that was wiser than looking ahead, his hammer slick with blood that did not belong to him. Behind them, the gold cloaks had gotten the smell of a purse they did not intend to lose. Ahead, the wood darkened, thickening into something old enough to turn the road aside. They made the bend and saw the holdfast. It was only a square of stone with a tower square within it and a gate like the narrow mouth of a stubborn man. The door had been barred ages ago and forgotten. Yoren slammed a fist at it and someone inside decided to be present. "Open," he said, in a voice that reminded Wood what it was made for. They squeezed through into a warren of straw and smoke. A woman with ash in her hair and 4 children hiding in her skirts looked at them with 3 parts suspicion and 1 part pity. "We have nothing," she said before anyone asked. "They took it all. They'll take you too, if you stand in the yard," Yoren said. He shoved a bar down, and the door made a sound like a sleeping bear. "Down. There's a place under the boards. Get into it. All of you," he told the boys, and the tone brooked nothing but yes. Gendry hesitated. "All," Yoren said again, and that was that. Sansa crawled into darkness and did not scream when spider webs made lace on her face. The space smelled of potatoes and old damp and the sorrow of things that grow in the dark. Arya came beside her and breathed so quietly Sansa could barely hear it. Above them, boots hammered boards. Voices pressed the room into smallness. Yoren's answer came like a bark. He lied with an ease that made Sansa suspicious and grateful. The fight, when it found them again, did not find them because they were clever. It found them because that is what fights do. The gold cloaks took the door down with a ram and then filled the holdfast with their need. Sansa could see men's calves in the cracks between the floorboards. She could hear the way iron bangs when it meets wood and then meets flesh. She wanted to count, to make numbers that would give the chaos shape, and the numbers would not stand still. When it was quiet, it was very quiet. The kind of quiet that holds breath after a cry. The trapdoor creaked. Yoren's face appeared upside down, gray with dust, blood in his hair. He grinned like he had lost a bet he intended to win anyway. "Up," he whispered. "Quick now, while the road is thinking it killed us." They slipped out into the yard. The gold cloaks lay as strewn as bad memories. One stirred. Arya stepped past him with small soft steps. She did not look at his face.
Sir.
It was not a face she needed to learn. Sansa's hands shook as though they were making something delicate out of porcelain and faith. They bolted for the trees and the river that was not far if the air smelled of it like that. Yoren led them into water to take their scent away. The cold blistered Sansa's shins and made her teeth chatter. The current tried to write its own story with their bodies as the ink. They crossed where the bottom felt like the back of some ancient fish and came out shivering and new on the other side. That night, they crept into a small, abandoned September. The god statue's face had been knocked off, perhaps for what it would fetch melted, and lay in a corner like a thing surpassed by usage. Sansa knelt before the headless shape out of habit. Arya stood, arms wrapped around herself, and watched the door. "Pray if you like," Yoren said, tearing a bit of illy-baked bread with his teeth. "Gods don't mind if you start late." Sansa prayed because there was nothing else she could do with her hands. She prayed to the mother to watch the small boys, to the father to weigh the scales of things accurately for once, to the maiden to cover her hair, to the warrior to make Yoren heavier when he swung, to the smith to look after Gendry's hammer, to the crone to light the way north and down and through the reeds. Then, because she was Ned Stark's daughter as much as she was Catelyn Tully's, she swallowed and let her mind go to roots and cold earth. She closed her eyes and pictured a white face carved in bark watching her, unblinking, and she prayed to something that had no name fit for lips, only a pain in the chest that felt very old and very awake. They moved before dawn. By late afternoon, the world changed. The land began to sink under their feet, and water shone in places where no river was marked. The road became stones set with more hope than wisdom, and the earth gathered itself into islands with reeds like spears around them. The air was a wet mouth. The sound of frogs came like gossip. "The neck," Yoren said, and spat into it as if to make it negotiate. "Keep your feet light. The ground don't care for weight." They were not alone. At first, Sansa thought it was the wind moving differently. Then she thought it was the moon shrugging off its reflection. Then a boat slid out from a stand of reeds with no sound at all, and there were two men in it, small and supple with skin the color of old leather and hair bound back with strips of something that had once been a plant and never a ribbon. Their spears looked like they had been grown rather than made. They watched without blinking, which was how Sansa knew at once to trust them. Men who blink a lot are preparing to lie. One of the boatmen raised 2 fingers in a sign Sansa did not know. Yoren answered with 2 fingers, then a thumb. Sansa wondered if the signs meant assurances or debts, or the exchange of an old joke. The boatman glanced over the party, taking everything and nothing in. When the nearer of the 2 looked at Sansa, the look did not snag. It moved across her like water across a stone and kept going. "Howland Reed sends you his words," the boatman said. His voice had a quiet shape. Words dropped from it like fish from a net. "He says the wolf is owed a path, and an old favor rests better when the house sleeps easy." Yoren snorted. "Tell him his marsh stinks and I don't like it, and tell him I like it better than the taste of Lannister iron." The boatman did not smile, but something flicked at the corner of his mouth. "Come," he said, and slid the boat around so that it made a place for them as lightly as a cat makes space for a second cat in a patch of sun. They were ferried like contraband over waters that held light in handfuls. Sometimes the boat ground on something Sansa's eyes swore was only a shadow, and sometimes it sailed clear where the reeds parted in a way that seemed a natural miracle. Twice their guide raised his hand and they froze, and twice riders appeared on the edge of what could not be called land. peering into gray-green, seeing nothing but their own certainty return to them. Once, the hound himself came as far as he could ride and watched the water as if at any moment it would surge up and gnaw the legs of his horse like bread. His helm made a dog of him, and Sansa's heart did a thing she had not known it could do. It split into memory and present and held both without breaking. She had liked him. He had frightened her. He had saved her once from a nightmare she had believed to be a man. He had scared her more because he had not pretended to be anything kinder than he was. He scanned the marsh and hesitated. The men behind him shifted in their saddles. The hound turned his horse and went back the way he had come. For a moment Sansa thought his head turned. She imagined his eyes were on some spot where the water held stiller than it had reason to. She imagined he saw her, not as Sela or as a smudge of boy, but as the girl who had listened to the things he said in the dark. Then he was gone, and she did not have to decide what she had imagined. Moat Cailin was the kind of ruin the world makes when it flips a page. Stones like giants' teeth stood up out of the hummocks. A tower reared, beheaded, and the top of the neck gaped like a wound that had decided to heal by scarring badly. The crannogmen moved through it as if it were a house they had built. They gave Yoren a hut that had reeds for a roof and the smell of damp forever, and somehow in that hut Sansa slept better than she had slept since the road had taken her feet. They were not there long. The night brought ravens, and one of them wore Winterfell's colors on its breast. It hopped onto Yoren's wrist like a guest, cocked its head, and delivered a caw that Sansa thought sounded like hunger and like home. Yoren took the small roll of leather from the bird's leg, unrolled it, and read by the tallow stub that lit the hut with a circle of amber. He did not speak at once. "What is it?" Arya said, too quick. She was all impatience and blade and child, and Sansa's heart went out to her because the impatience made her look so small, for all her sharp edges. Yoren passed the letter to Sansa and to Arya together, and maybe he had meant to give it to one and perhaps to the other, and then he decided he would not choose. Sansa held the paper. The words swam for a heartbeat. Then they steadied into the shape of Maester Luwin's hand. He was not a man given to decoration. His letters looked like they had been built with a square and a plum. Lord Eddard taken in the capital. Treason said. War stirs the south. Robb calls men to Winterfell. The Lady Catelyn is upon the trident. Come swift. Sansa read it again, and then turned it over as if the back would help. She felt the shape of the world change again, as if a great hand had tilted the board. Arya's breath went in with a small hiss and did not come out. Yoren took the paper back and folded it neatly. "Home," he said, and Sansa did not think she had ever heard him say a word so gently. The crannogmen gave them 2 gray boats and a man in each who said nothing for 3 days and then said only, "Step like this." When they reached a place where stepping otherwise would have meant teaching their lungs to drink, wild white flowers grew out of the muck like bits of cloud that had come down to rest. Birds watched from eyes bright as coins. The world felt not new but old in the way that makes men who are clever understand that cleverness is only a thing you put on in the morning, like a cloak, and not the stuff your bones are made of. Winterfell rose like a thing remembered, even through the haze of distance. Smoke lifted from the kitchens in a ribbon that made Sansa's chest ache. The towers did not look like a page in a book. They looked like a line of men with their heads held high. She tasted salt at the back of her throat without knowing why. Arya's hand found hers and squeezed once. Hard. Sansa squeezed back, and that was language enough. Maester Luwin met them at the gate with his chain clinking a small, polite music. His face was white around the eyes in a way that said he was not sleeping enough but was not allowing himself to stop. "My ladies," he said, and then stopped, because the word did not fit the girls in rough spun with caps low and filth on their hands. He swallowed. He opened his arms. Sansa went into them without noticing she had decided to do that. Arya hung back a heartbeat and then went, too, and Luwin bent around both of them, chain pressed between cheek and shoulder. Bran waited in the yard on a carved chair, the basket saddle not far and hotter behind, shifting foot to foot like a tree ashamed of being so young. Summer lifted his head and sniffed and then came trotting, eyes bright. He put his muzzle under Arya's hand, and she scratched him in a way that said she remembered where the good spot was without having to think. Rickon lurked behind a pillar and then hurtled out, wild hair flying, shaggy dog a black streak beside him, teeth bared at a world that had given the boy the wrong lesson first. "You're back," Bran said, as if the word might be enough. Sansa knelt and put her arms about him. She realized, as she smelled the oil the maester had rubbed into the chair's wood, and the leather of Bran's belt, and the boy smell of Bran that persisted beneath everything, that she had half expected him to be larger or smaller or changed into something else entirely. He was Bran. He held on to her as if he were a cliff and she were the storm, or the other way around. That night the hall was full of noise that tried to be celebration and settled, because it had to, for relief. Men toasted the gods, and their cups clinked with a sound like loose coins. The direwolves lay near the dais, tongues lolling, while the fire painted their coats copper. Sansa ate and did not taste. Arya cut bread and meat and did not look where the knife went. When the music started, it sounded as if it had been learned in another country and brought north in a bag. It took a few measures to remember how it was supposed to go. There were letters, more letters. One from Catelyn that had been carried with a torn wing and a stubborn heart across miles and fights and rain. Luwin read it aloud in his careful voice because Catelyn had asked him to. Sansa sat with her hands in her lap, and her mind made a picture of her mother at a window in Riverrun with the river running under it as water will, holding the pen like a spear she had been given because no man was near enough with the right kind of hand. "My sweet ones," it read, "my brave ones. The world is trying to make something of us. Let us make something of it first. Keep each other like bread keeps and like iron keeps and like the winter keeps its memories. The river runs and all things in it move toward the sea. Hold fast. Love, mother." Sansa did not know she was crying until Arya put a hand over her fingers. Sansa turned her palm up and held on. It was only days after their return that the raven came with a black ribbon about its leg, which is not a thing ravens like, and so men do it for their own satisfaction. It perched on the hooded hand of a boy and complained about the indignity of its travel in a steady scold that even Luwin found amusing for a breath. Then Luwin unwound the black and broke the seal and read the neat letters once, and then once again as if hoping he had misread them into a different world. Sansa knew by the way his mouth set into its line that had nothing to do with old age. Arya knew by the way Summer lifted his head and whined in a way that wasn't hunger and wasn't boredom. Bran knew by the look exchanged between Luwin and Ser Roderick, whose mustache seemed to droop lower with the weight of the thing in the air. On the steps of the Great September, Luwin began and the hall did. Something quiet. There are kinds of silence that are different meals served at the same table. This was the kind that comes when a man prepares to pull a bandage and show the wound. "Lord Eddard." He did not get farther before his voice cracked. He shook it into obedience. Lord Eddard was. He groped for the word that would be both accurate and kind, and the world does not often allow men to have both. He was taken from us. Sansa's breath went out of her as if the air had been taken by a thief who had not meant to be cruel and ended up that way. She did not see the room. She saw a pool of water catching lantern light. She saw the shape of a man's hand setting a feather in her hair when she was small and squirming, the hand surprising itself with its tenderness. She saw a white face carved of living wood. She heard Arya make a sound that was not a child's sound. It had the wild in it and something that would someday be a woman's lament. And in it for a moment Sansa heard Lady's last cry and the echo of wolves on a winter night and the deep, slow moan of the wall after a storm. The sound split her. It made a place for grief to go that was not inside the small vessel of her body, where it would have burned her clean. When she could see again, she saw Arya's fists clenched together until the knuckles looked like ice pebbles. She saw Bran's eyes the color of water when it is very still, and she saw Rickon run out of the hall with Shaggy Dog at his heels, and she knew that the beast would keep men from following and the boy would kick the stones at the base of the heart tree until his toes bled. She stood, not because standing was useful, but because sitting felt like staying in a place she could not remain. She went into the God's Wood and Arya came with her. The air there was colder. The leaves whispered to one another, and Sansa did not have to pretend any longer that she belonged to the Seven. She knelt in the damp before the heart tree. She had not realized she had missed as much as she had. The face in the trunk watched with the patience of old pain. Sansa had never liked the sight of the red sap, but she understood it now in the same way you understand your own blood the first time it runs from a cut deep enough to change you. Arya stood with her feet set apart like a fighter and stared into the carved eyes until her own blurred. "Not today," Arya whispered to the tree, and Sansa didn't need to be told what she meant. "Not ever, if I can make it so." She put a hand on the trunk, palm to rough bark. "He told her to run," she said, and Sansa realized with a shock that Arya was talking about someone else. Someone back there. Someone with a braid and a stick and water in her movements. And she did. "We ran. We're not done running." Sansa pressed her forehead to the bark and felt the cold creep into her skin. "We will not be little birds," she said to the wood. "We will be what we must." "Wolves," Arya said, and the tree held their word. Robb's banners rose like autumn rides up an aspen. All at once and with a rustle you could hear for miles if you were quiet and the wind was right. Men poured into Winterfell with stories on their tongues and fear tucked in their belts. The Grachan's voice boomed. Lord Karstark stood like a tall shadow. Roose Bolton's eyes were pale and patient. Sansa did not like them and did not yet know why. Ser Roderick's mustache seemed to lead him into tasks before his courage had time to object. The young lords ate and swore and clasped wrists and did not meet the eyes of the Stark girls unless they were forced to. Sansa learned to be the face of a house in short order. She sat beside Bran when Bran needed her, a composed lady beside a composed little lord. She spoke to maids in a tone that made them breathe easier and to squires in a tone that made them try to stand straighter and not spill soup. She stood with Maester Luwin when he met the small folk who came with wishes and needs and news. She took women aside who had lost sons already to small misfortunes, so that the large misfortune ahead would not shatter them all at once. Courtesy, her mother had said, is a small coin you spend and somehow never run out of. In Sansa's hands it became a shield, and she learned the shapes of it until she could hold it without looking. Arya haunted the yard. She fetched things men did not know they had left behind and returned them with the bluntness of a boy who does not fear thanks. She learned the names of the hounds and the men who fed them. She made a friend of Mikken's apprentice and stole 2 hours a week to put her hands on a practice sword in a way that made even Ser Roderick admit that a little girl might be given exceptions in a world where wolves were dead and a lord was gone. She rode a shaggy little pony that had a temper like a pot left on a banked fire, and she learned to keep a light seat even when the pony argued. She made mistakes. She got up after them like a boy who expects more. Once, in the yard, the men raised a cheer that felt too big for the walls. Sansa came out into the sunlight to see Robb in mail and surcoat, his hair full of light, a sword on his hip with the look of a thing that has been made an heirloom in an instant. He did not look their age, not anymore. He did not look like a man, not yet, but he looked like a promise of one that had more steel than tenderness in it at the moment. He found his sisters with his eyes, and for a heartbeat the weight went out of his shoulders. He came to them and put his hands on their heads like a blessing, one brief pressure each, and then went back to his men. "The South will come to us if we sit and wait," he said in the hall that night, and the hall listened. "My father sits in a cell or he sits with the gods, and I will not know which until I look the man who made it so in the face." He raised his cup, and the wine looked almost as dark as the red leaves outside. "To the north," he said. "To the north," the men said, and the word moved up and around the beams and into the mortar and into Sansa's skin, where it lived. On the morning that Robb rode, the yard was a lake of men and motion. Sansa watched from the steps with Bran and Arya and Rickon, who had been coaxed from under a bench with promises of meat and stories. The dire wolves threaded the crowd like wind. The banners shook and snapped, a forest of sigils. The sun found the steel and made small suns everywhere. Robb came to the steps and kissed his brothers on their brows and kissed his sister's hands. When he did, Sansa felt the slight prune of scars in his palm that she had not known were there. War had already started, it seemed, in places that did not bleed. "Look after them," he said to Luwin. "Look after Winterfell." "We will," Sansa said, and heard herself not as a girl but as a lady. She felt the weight of the promise and took it up. Arya nodded with her chin jutted, which meant every vow she made would be kept with stubbornness and with her teeth if need be. The northern host flowed through the gate with a sound like a river shedding ice. The quiet after made Winterfell seem taller. Sansa breathed out and did not realize she had been holding her breath since the horns started to blow. Letters came in steady procession after. Some were news and some were basically wishful thinking with ink on it. Sansa learned to tell the difference by the way a man's hand made his letters lean. She learned that men who hoped too boldly wrote with flourishes that made their words look fancier and emptier. She learned that fear was a kind of economy that made sentences short. She learned that hope could be useful if you let it draw maps but not lead the march. One letter came with a thin bit of silk tied around it. It smelled faintly of something she could not name but thought of as the air of a city before a storm. It claimed to come from a friend in King's Landing and did not sign itself, which made it feel more like a stone thrown through a window than a letter slipped under a door. It advised against trusting Freys, which was perhaps like advising a man not to trust his hunger. It advised that the lion had more than claws. It advised that the game the queen played was not meant to be won by anyone but the queen. Sansa read it to Luwin and then read it again to herself later in her chamber and thought of a man with rings on his fingers who had said things that seemed harmless until you were inside them and found the edges were knives. She folded the letter and put it with a small handful of keeps she kept under a floorboard she had pried loose with her fingernails. Arya had a similar floorboard. They did not talk about them, and so they knew what the other kept had weight. Summer slept under Arya's window some nights and under Sansa's others. Shaggy Dog patrolled as if the fear that lived in Rickon's small body had made the wolves his obligations more solemn. Once, in the deepest hour of night that is not yet morning, there came a high far howl that made both girls sit up in bed at once. It was answered by Summer's thrum and Shaggy's ripped shout. Sansa thought, not in words exactly, Nymeria. Arya stood at the window and put her hand against the cold glass and did not cry and did not say her name. Snow came false and early, a sprinkle like salt on meat. Men grumbled about it as men will grumble about anything that gives them a story and a complaint in the same handful. The women put on their heavier cloaks and looked up with the eyes of people who weigh winters. Sansa felt the cold like a tonic. It made her certain of the shape of the land and the way her breath went out in a cloud that showed her she was here. The war moved beyond them and carried them with it from afar. Word came that the Riverlands burned and that Tywin Lannister set his table in a black castle, whose stones had never been happy with the men they had to shelter. Word came that Uncle Edmure had been taken and that Uncle Brynden had laughed and found another way to spit on a man who thought himself too clean to spit back. Word came that Robb had crossed a river men had thrown wards like dice over, that he had taken a price from Lannister banners that would never be paid in anything but suns and steel. Once, a raven came with nothing in its foot. It circled Winterfell twice and then set down on the heart tree with a scold, as if the old gods had neglected to give it more sense. Arya laughed and flung it bits of bread from her pocket, and Sansa stood beside her and watched the bird hop and felt something like a shift of weather in her chest. It occurred to her that grief had not ended. It had moved path and she was walking it. When word finally reached them of what had been done on the steps of the Great September in King's Landing, it came not as letters but as stories from 3 different mouths, none of which could quite bring themselves to the same conclusion about why the boy king had done what he had. Sansa took the 3 and held them like sticks for the fire and decided she would not throw any of them away. Men do not become better because the world learns only one of their reasons. She went to the Godswood and sat with Arya and spoke their father's name in a voice that did not ask the wood to answer. The wind moved the leaves, and that was answer enough. What had changed by then, what made all the difference that would ripple down into the songs boys yet unborn would make up in alleys and halls, was that Sansa was not in the city to be bent into a shape that suited a crown. She was in the north learning to make her face a wall and her voice a roof, and she was teaching herself the difference between breaking and shaping. Arya was not running the roads with one small blade and a list that would outgrow even her hunger. She was in Winterfell with a pony that taught her patience and a brother's hall that taught her how to speak to men so they listened, without being challenged. She was learning that sometimes a small girl becomes dangerous not because she is a blade but because she keeps a blade in a place unexpected. There are many small turns in a river, and any one of them can change where the water ends. In those first months, what changed was not the war, which raged, nor the games people in warm climates play with coins and crowns. It was the sound of feet in Winterfell's halls. It was two girls sleeping under a roof that remembered them, waking to duties and to dangers that asked less for pretty answers and more for iron in the spine. On a morning when the frost had bitten the edges of the grass and the kennelmaster's breath came white, a messenger rode into the yard with his horse blown and his face gray. He had a piece of brown cloth on his sleeve that made Sansa think not of any house she knew but of a town that wanted to be more than it was. He cried for Ser Roderick and for any Stark that listened. He said, his voice so raw that Luwin winced, that the sea to the west had begun to remember the ways it could bite, and that old, wet oaths on rocky islands were waking to challenge the dry ones made in tall halls. Sansa felt the world tilt again and stood steady. "Come," she said to Arya later, "in the Godswood where they went to speak when they did not want anyone to hear them but the thing in the leaves that never answered and so was safe to tell everything to. We will not be made small by any of this. We will do what we can do, and we will do more than that when we have to." Arya nodded once, her face the face she had when she set her feet in a certain way and made men who had mocked find their throats cooler. "I'm not done learning," she said. "Neither am I," Sansa said, surprised to find how true the words tasted. She took Arya's hand. It was not a thing they had done much as children. Sansa had thought hand-holding was for Septa Mordain to encourage and for little girls to giggle about. This felt like a line drawn on a map that they made themselves. They stood like that under the red leaves, two pieces of a house that had been broken and was being made again, not with the smoothness of what it had been, but with the strength the breaking had given it. Somewhere far away, the hound looked at water and thought things he would never say. Somewhere nearer, wolves lifted their voices and made a sound that made the hairs on the back of men's necks insist they were alive in a world that had not finished with them. And the North, which had no king until one rose and would have none again until another did or none at all depending on the songs, kept its own counsel and watched the roads. The girls in the gray stone kept theirs too. They practiced the set of the mouth that says no. They practiced the lift of the chin that says yes and only when they mean it. They spoke their father's name in a place the bark would remember it. They learned to count the gains alongside the losses, which is what keeps a ledger honest. And though men in red kept winning pieces on boards far away, somewhere in the reeds, men with frog spears and patience smiled and said to one another that a debt had been paid, and that this too would have its ripples. In a holdfast burned to ash beside a road men forgot to call a road, Hot Pie would someday teach himself to make bread shaped like wolves and sell it for coppers that added up to a life, and if you asked him about the day the old man with the stick had cracked a gold cloak under the chin, he would tell it badly and with too much relish and make it mean something bigger than he knew because that is what the little lives of great stories do. In a forge 2 towns away, a boy with arms like branches would put a hammer to iron and remember the first time it unmade a bone and forge something better every time to prove the hammer had other uses. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark learned to be the sort of woman who can hold a hall together while the wind tears at its thatch. Arya Stark learned to be the sort of girl whose patience is the most dangerous thing about her, and whose impatience she kept like a blade well-oiled and out of sight. They had gone north before the city broke, and so the breaking did not break them. It remade them, which is a kind of breaking that keeps. And in the keeping, the pack, thin and hungry and fewer than it had been, found ways to live that the songs had not yet learned to sing. The morning after the raven, the gods would war frost like a veil. Gray light dripped through the remaining leaves and made the red of the heart tree look deeper, less like paint and more like something that had seeped up out of the earth and could not be scoured away by weather or by grief. Sansa rose before the cook fires and went to the kitchens with her cloak drawn tight. She knew the way in the dark now without a taper. Bread proved better when hands that cared for it smoothed it down and tucked it up, and the small folk had made room for her there without saying they had. She liked the sound of dough being slapped and folded, the quiet hiss when the first kettles came to a boil, the watchful bustle. Men can make a story of every meal, her mother had said once, but women make the meals that make the stories possible. Maester Luwin found her among sacks of oats and the squeak of the cheese press, his chain chiming lightly as he navigated baskets and lads hurrying with their heads down. He looked smaller when he first woke, before purpose rounded his shoulders. "2 riders at the east gate," he said, breath frosting. "From the neck." Howland Reed's name moved through the castle like a remembered wind. No one had seen him at Winterfell in Sansa's lifetime, and yet his absence had weight, the way a father's word cast its shadow even from a distance. Sansa wiped flour from her hands and followed Luwin out into the courtyard, where the stone held the night's cold, and let it go reluctantly. He riders were a brother and sister, tall only for crannogmen, reed slim where northerners were trunk stout. The boy's hair was the color of river mud, and his eyes had a pale green to them that made Sansa think of new leaves under ice. He could not have been much older than Arya. The girl's hair was darker, braided back into a tail that lay like a snake across the quiver on her shoulder. She carried a spear whose point looked grown rather than hammered. Their clothes were greens and browns and river grays, so true the eye lost them if it wandered. They dismounted in silence and bowed, their gestures tidy and without flourish. Luwin gave their names before they spoke, as if he had been expecting the names to arrive and had a shelf cleared for them. "Jojen and Mira Reed." "From Greywater," the girl said. Her voice was low, a hand on water. "From our father, with words and with us." She glanced past Sansa then and smiled a little without letting it sit on her mouth. "You must be Arya." "I must," Arya said from where she had appeared on the steps, hair growing back into a dark thatch under her cap, eyes bright with the echoes of the road. She came down with her light, quick stride, a grace that had more utility than prettiness in it, and looked over the spear like it might decide to speak if addressed politely. "Can you throw that far? Or do you put it where it needs to go before any man thinks to move?" Mira's smile showed itself fully for a heartbeat. "Both," she said. "And you must be Sansa," Jojen said, and Sansa wondered at the must in his voice, as if the world had lines that drew themselves and he had learned to read the angles. "The Reeds carry news north. Our father says the marsh remembers when a man stands by another man without counting the cost. The marsh sends thanks." "Your father needs no thanks," Sansa said. She thought of the boat sliding silent among the reeds as if it had been made out of reed as much as wood, and of the way the air had seemed to hold them with both hands. "He has ours. He will have them more when we send them south with something that deserves the name." Jojen's gaze went to the heart tree and rested there. "The trees have been full of dreams," he said, as if no one in the yard could possibly mistake those words for weather talk. "The dreams have been full of winter and of wolves." "Wolves we have," Bran said dryly from his carved chair, Hodder behind him with his patient giant's watchfulness. He had wheeled himself out to the yard when Luwin sent a boy to his solar. "Winter is coming. It's not a dream to say so." Jojen looked at Bran with those pale green eyes and seemed to look a long way. "Not all winters come by snow," he said. "Some are carried by men." In the days that followed, Mira's laugh became a sound in the yard winter had to make room for. She moved through Winterfell's shapes like water traveling between stones, showing the stable boy how to set a snare with a bit of gut and patience, turning a rope into a weapon in a space between breaths, dropping to a crouch so the pup that had started sleeping under the brewhouse would nose her fingers and learn quickly that hands could be trusted. Arya followed her with the hungry curiosity that made men double their knots when she walked by them. They sparred with sticks in a patch of earth behind the kennels until their shins were a study in bruise colors. Sansa watched with interest she would not have known how to confess 2 months before. There was something in the clean line of the spear's throw, the way Mira's breath left her at release, that spoke to Sansa of gentle mother and hard crone both. Jojen sat with Bran in the Godswood in the early hours, when the day's first breath made the frost smoke and the air felt fresh sharpened. Sansa began to learn the particular quiet of their speech, words that felt less like plans and more like maps spreading out on a table. "You must learn to see with more than eyes," Jojen would say. "You must learn to be still as a pond that nevertheless shows the clouds moving above it." Bran's voice in answer grew slower, not with reluctance but with caution. like a boy setting his foot on a stone in a stream to test if it wobbled. Sansa knelt by the heart tree sometimes and tried to hear what they heard. When she did not see, as Bran said he did, the way a wolf sees when its mind goes like smoke to settle somewhere hot-breathed and full of scent. She did not see through leaves a man who had left his sword leaning against the wrong wall, did not look down from the rookery's height to watch a boy with a sling make himself braver by striking a tower's stones when nobody watched. She felt instead, when she could feel anything at all, the weight of the hall when its benches were full and the warmth those bodies made together, the justice of grain counted out fairly, the rightness of a name said properly in greeting and in farewell. Perhaps this, too, was a kind of seeing, and perhaps it was only being a lady in practice and not in page. It did not matter, she decided, as long as she did it well. News of Robb came with cold air under it. The raven that brought the first letter of triumph flapped into the yard with a ruefulness that made young Tom, the falconer's helper, grin and say the bird had come to confess a sin. Luwin broke the wax with fingers that did not shake. By the Whispering Wood, he read. We took a lion. The Kingslayer is chain-wrapped and silent. Lord Bolton marches to take Harrenhal. The Riverlands breathe, if not easy yet. The Great John laughs. Grey wind has the scent of their fear. The hall was full that night, and men lifted their cups to the rafters with real heat in their eyes. Sansa sat a moment with her hands around her wine and let the words unroll inside her. A king's ransom sat in her brother's camp, and the name behind that ransom was a blade edge. She thought of Jaime Lannister's hair in the sunlight of King's Landing. Brig. HT as a coin. She thought of the scent of hot steel. She discovered in herself a hard little knot of something like satisfaction and did not feel guilty for it. She wrote to Robb. Her hand, when she took up the quill, trembled for a moment, then steadied. She told him in neat, unfancy lines that Winterfell was fed and kept, that Bran sat in judgment on small wrongs and did it with a dignity that made even stubborn men change the set of their shoulders, that Rickon had learned to climb to places that made old women cluck and then get down from them without breaking his neck. She wrote that their mother's words moved through the hall like a flensing, taking away the easy lies and leaving men with what they could bear. She did not have to write that their father was dead. There was not a patch of air nor a cup nor a bench that did not carry that truth in its grain. She did write, in a smaller hand that made her think of secrets spoken in corners, that the Reed children had come and that Bran was hearing things only he could hear, and that the Godswood had never felt so awake to her. Though she knew as she set the quill down that this would not be the part Robb read 3 times. It began to snow for true. The first big flakes came in a midday that had had the look of rain and then changed its mind. The flakes were as wide as Sansa's thumbnail and drifted down in the lazy, confident way of a weather that knew what it wanted. Winterfell took it the way an old man takes a familiar ache, without panic, with grudging respect. Sansa heard the hiss they made on the first hot stones and had to swallow against an unexpected rush of gladness. The snow softened the edges of everything that had felt too sharp. On a night when the snow made the moonlight seem thicker, Theon Greyjoy rode into Winterfell with 4 men and a smile like a polished coin. Bright, practical, giving back light without keeping any. Sansa was returning from the kitchens again with her veil full of apples for the hall when the gatehouse sent a boy to fetch Luwin and Ser Rodrik both. By the time she found a place near the yard's edge, Theon had dismounted and thrown his reins to a stable lad without a glance to see if the boy fumbled. He pushed his hood back with a pat gesture like a man smoothing a woman's hair. "My lords," he said expansively to the whole yard, as if no one here knew him, "I have the sea in my eyes and salt in my blood and glad tidings in my saddlebag." Ser Rodrik's mustache twitched. "You have grown your beard stupid," he observed. "Best trim it, or lice will do it for you." Theon laughed too loudly. "A jest, my old bear." He spread his arms, then thought better of embracing the castellan when he caught the look in Ser Rodrik's old soldier's eyes. He turned to Sansa and bowed with a flourish he had learned in someone else's hall. "My lady," he said, and she was suddenly so aware of the apple weight in her veil that she tucked it against her hip and made a lady's small inclination of the head before remembering she had mud on the hem of her dress. Theon's gaze stuck there for half a heartbeat. "Winterfell swan in kitchen feathers," he said, and meant it as charm. "And you, a kraken in a pond," Arya said, from behind Sansa's shoulder. Theon's laugh creaked. "I come from Pike," he said more loudly, "for the yard. I come with a father's word to a son." He looked at Robb's banners where they hung still and stiff as if they disapproved of the lack of wind. "I come to bring the Iron Islands into the war. We will shake the coasts until Lannisters cannot hear themselves lie." Ser Roderick took it in with the outward impatience of a man who has fed colts and knows the look of a young stallion that thinks it invented running. "And do you bring men?" he said. "Or only your smile?" He did not bother to look at Theon's four, who stood in a clump, not trying hard enough to look unimpressed and so giving themselves away as impressed by everything. "Men," Theon said, too quickly. "Ships. My father has only to say the word." "And has he said it?" Luwin asked mildly. Theon's jaw set for an instant. Sansa saw the brief click of teeth. "He will," he said. "Any day. He respects strength. Robb has strength. He will recognize it." His eyes went to Sansa again as if there were strength of another kind there to recognize and make use of. "He will want to see what he gets for it." "Winterfell is not a ship," Sansa said before she could temper it. "We do not need to be shown to anyone to be what we are." Theon laughed as if she had meant to be clever. "How you've sharpened," he said, and the edge he heard pleased him because he mistook it for admiration. "He stayed the night because you do not turn away men out of winter if you can feed them, and you do not show their pride back to them in a mirror." He told stories at the end of the bench that made the boys grin and the older men look at their cups. He spoke of storms he had seen from the lee side, as if the seeing were the same as the weathering. He lounged in the great hall under the direwolf's gaze and smiled when he thought he was not being watched at girls carrying trenchers. Once Sansa caught him watching Bran, and the look on his face in that unguarded moment was not something she could name easily. Hunger, yes, but of a shape and size that made it less about food and more about proving to himself that his teeth were sharp enough to eat something with bones. When he left in the morning, Sansa stood on the wall walk and watched him ride away with his four. His cloak spread like the shadow of a gull on snow. "He is not a friend," she said to Arya without looking away. "I know," Arya said. She leaned against the crenellation, dark hair whipping. "He looks like a boy who wants to be a story. Stories have lessons," Sansa said. "He hasn't learned any yet." The letters that came after did not wear any sigil Sansa could trust. They arrived folded and refolded, dirt in th. Ir creases, carried by men whose eyes went everywhere at once. They bore words that were like the words from the night before. Men always pick up the same words to talk about victory and fear, and yet they did not fit right in the ear. Sansa read one by the heart tree and let the letters weigh themselves in her hand. The words said the Ironborn gathered ships. The words said they were raiding for practice. The words said they would not be anyone's men but their own. Luwin made a thoughtful sound and sent ravens west in 3 directions at once. Spring did not come. The snow went and came again. The river put on a skin and sloughed it off and put it on again. Sansa learned to count barley down to the last sack and doubled the small gardens within the castle walls. "It will seem foolish work," she told the kitchen women. "When the summer comes back, work is foolish sometimes. Do it anyway." They nodded to one another and to her and sent the little boys to turn the soil with sticks under the old trees where the grass refused to die. The summons from Torrens Square came hard and late, as if men had held it in their teeth and run through thicket. The raven's leg was scored, as if the string had cut it. Ser Roderick read aloud in a voice that tried not to show his anger and failed to hide it. "Dagmar Cleftjaw, raiding the coast. The tall ships have taken 2 little ones. Swords at the foot of the square's walls." The rest of it was names and numbers and the measured panic of a man trying to keep his mind clear while someone shouted in his ear. "They're testing the lock," Ser Roderick said through his mustache. He looked at Bran. "We can break their hand for it." Winterfell's garrison was thin. It had been thin since Robb rode south, and thinner since Ser Roderick sent a third of what remained to hold the White Knife's crossings. There were men enough to hold against a guess and not a plan. "We should not empty the yard," Sansa said, and felt the weight of every look turned to her. She was not shy of it anymore. We should send enough to shame them and keep enough to make men who count our numbers wrong. Ser Roderick frowned and pulled at his mustache. How many, then, my lady? She stood with the geometry of stone and gates and men in her head. The shape was not pretty, but it was sound. 40 good men, she said. No more than 50. Take the mules with panniers full of empty skins. Make it look as if we know we're staying, not going. Have riders move back and forth from dawn to dusk so that anyone watching will count too many with the same fingers. You speak like the crone, Ser Roderick said, not unkindly. He glanced at Lewin. The maester nodded once. They left at dawn. A hard knot of men in greys and browns with a wooden-faced determination about them. Ser Roderick's armor did not fit quite well anymore, but he wore it with the air of a father putting on his old wedding coat because he must. Sansa stood on the wall and watched him ride away. He did not look back. The yard was too quiet after. Bran rolled forward and set his chair between the guards by the gate, stubborn. Sansa did not move him. They held like that for 3 days, waiting for mirthless news to arrive from the west. That the Iron Men had slunk away, shamed, or that they had pulled down some poor man's pig house and called it glory. The news that came instead was a shout from the ring wall and the slam of the inner gate's bar as men set it in place with hands gone clumsy. Sansa ran for the yard. With the first glance she knew what kind of trouble had found them. The banners were a dull, wet black, stitched with gold that caught the snowlight like sick sunlight. A kraken spread itself on a field, obscene and smug. The men beneath those banners were leather and salt and iron, and they moved with the insolence of invaders who had found a door unlatched. They had climbed out of the yard they came to claim. All night, while the watch changed at the same times it always had, while a stable boy snored nose down in a warm horse and woke with straw stuck to his cheeks, while Sansa slept the sleep that comes after hours at Sums, they had moved through shadow to shadow, the way rats move behind walls. Somebody knew our sleep, Arya said beside Sansa, which was not what a girl says when she sees an enemy for the first time, but what a hunter says when she discovers the way her own campfire smoke has traveled. Theon, Sansa murmured, and surprised herself by how little it surprised her. The leader of them pulled his helm free with an easy tug. For a heartbeat she did not know him, and then she put the piece of him she had seen by the hearth beside this man with the snow crusting his beard and the wolf head sewn on his cloak like a skin someone had peeled from a true animal and made counterfeit. He smiled up at the wall like he had arrived for a feast. Winterfell, he called, as if the stone needed to be told what it was. I've come home. You were never home, Arya hissed. Men scrambled to order. A horn blew, wrong for this hour, frightened in its sound. The little garrison mustered, some buckling straps as they ran, some with hair still damp and beards half-made. Hodder stood in the yard, breath steaming, head turning toward shouting like a hound who has been called in 3 directions at once and wishes he could obey all. Maester Luwin slid to Sansa's side. Under, he said softly. To the crypts. No, Sansa said. Not yet. She could feel the heart tree at her back even at the wall. The Godswood was behind everything, watching. We do not abandon the yard. We do not give them the picture they want. She knelt to Bran's level. Back to the keep, Bran, she said. Lock the doors. Take Rickon below and Osha with him. Luwin with you. She lifted her voice. Jorian, the new captain, barely older than Gendry, with a stripling beard that had come in patchy. Hold the inner gate. Nobody opens it unless I call their name. Shiar. Eached Arya with her eyes. Go. Where? Arya said at once, ready to run anywhere there was need. The kitchens, Sansa said. The back passages. The doors no man of the sea knows. Keep eyes. Keep silent unless the silence is wrong. They had learned to talk like this in sharp shortcuts. It had started with games. If you had a crumb for every step, would you eat it or mark your way, and become a way to say, I trust you to carry a piece of this. Theon walked into the courtyard like a bridegroom. He had maybe 20 with him inside the walls. More waited outside by the gate and took their time making themselves count. He looked around as if to remind himself where he had slept. A boy given a man's key. "Bring me the keys," he called, eyes finding Sansa on the wall and widening with the surprise a man feels when a coin isn't where he left it and the purse feels light. He laughed when he saw Bran's chair moving back toward the keep. "Not so quick," he said, and two of his men loped forward with that easy seaman's stride, spear points up, as if they knew what they were doing was wrong and the spears would make it right. Gray shapes came out of the kennels like weather. Summer was nothing like a dog when he ran, and Shaggy Dog was less than a dog and more than a storm. The men with spears forgot what their hands held. One threw his spear by reflex and it clanged off stone and rang like a dull bell. Summer took his man by the thigh and shook once, hard, like the end of a necessary task. Shaggy hit the other under the arm and hurled him aside. The yard filled with sound. The iron cry of a man who has been bitten in a way he does not know how to understand. The cracked calls of men trying to make sense into orders. Hodders distressed hotter, hotter, as he backed toward the keep with eyes big as moons. "Pretty pets," Theon said. There was strain under the words now. He had not counted on this, Sansa realized with a small, keen shock of satisfaction. He had counted many ways. Not this. Black Lauren, big and slow-eyed, moved forward and planted himself with a patience that spoke of decks and storms endured. "Shields," he said in his dull, dangerous voice. "Make a wall." 6 Ironborn stepped into the shape of one. The wolves felt the change in the air and circled, low, hackles up, eyes hot. "Stop," Sansa said then, in a voice that did not have to be loud. "Theon." She leaned on his name, as if it were a spear she could use. "We can talk. You can surrender," he said, but his eyes flicked to the wolves again and to the keep door, where Bran had just slid through with Hodder and Osha and Luwin. The bar thumped down on the other side with a sound that made satisfaction skate across Sansa's skin. She breathed for the first time since the horn blew. "We can make terms," she said. She needed time. She needed Howland Reed. She needed the men at Torrance Square to read their road and run the right way. She needed to put Arya on a line that would pull open a door when she tugged. "If you want Winterfell," Sansa said, "you need food. You need roofs. You need hands that know which gates stick. You need Blanche to tell you which sow will birth piglets in the night without help and which will kill her young if you touch her. You need more than a banner you like. You need the folk who live under it." He blinked. He had not counted on words being used this way. He had learned to talk in rooms where men made small refusals that led to large favors. He had not thought a girl's courtesy was a net. Sansa showed him nothing of the satisfaction she felt at that, either. "Let's talk then," he said in the end, masking uncertainty with the broad gesture of a man inviting Grace to sit at his table. He took the great hall, as men take halls, by standing where the tapestries throw their colored shadows and having his voice be the one that climbs the rafters. His men filled the spaces poorly, too much leather where wool should be, too much salt stink where beer and smoke should do the work. Sansa stood on the step below the dais and kept her hands folded. She had a shawl around her shoulders and the shawl kept her posture honest. She could feel the eyes of the small folk of the scullery girls, of grizzled Hansa and Joe to his left, whose knees had never mended right, of Palla with her baby at the breast, and of Rykk who could not count past 8 and therefore counted every time on his fingers. They needed to see the right shape. She held it. "The king in the north," Theon announced, savoring it, "is far away. His wolves are with him. Winterfell has a kraken in the gate." He grinned, and his teeth looked very white. "I, Theon of House Greyjoy, hold this castle now. I will be your lord. Bend the knee and no one will be harmed. Fail and—" He let it hang, an invitation to picture your own fear. "You are a guest, set his plate wrong," Sansa said before anyone could dislodge sense from their mouths. "My lord brother rides at war. Winterfell is not a toy you pick up when a boy leaves a room. It is a house. It has a heart. The heart bleeds," Theon said, nodding toward the door that had swallowed Bran. "I will find the little lords and I will sit them on chairs if I need to. I will carry about their names in my mouth and spit them where necessary." He looked at Sansa then as if only in that moment did he remember to enjoy the part of his performance that most pleased him. I could use a true heart Stark by my side as I set the place to rights. I could use a lady who knows which keys jangle into which doors. Bend the knee, Sansa, and Winterfell will have at least one lovely thing in it that doesn't snarl. She thought of Septa Mordane's heavy hand on her own fingers to press them flat when she had been 11 and her pen had leaned too eagerly. She thought of the way her father's mouth had gone soft when he smiled. She thought of Arya moving like a cat through a doorway no one else saw and Jojen's pale eyes and Mira's SP. She let her breath be visible when she let it out. She curtsied with the correct degree for the situation of a lord who thinks himself a lord and is not. "As my lord commands," she said. If the room had been the kind of room where people think with their mouths, there would have been a ripple of shock. It was not. It was Winterfell. People watched and said nothing. A scullion girl with a nervous habit of popping her jaw cracked her knuckles instead, and the tiny sound felt like a blessing. She bent because it was a way to stand. Theon smiled without quite managing to make his eyes do the same. "Clever, clever," he murmured like a man tasting a dish he had not expected to like. They spent the afternoon walking the walls. Theon liked to see himself being shown things. Sansa brought him where she wanted him. She brought him to the broken crenellation near the armory where a man could wedge his boot if he needed to climb, and did not know there was a loose stone 2 feet over that would kill him if it fell on his head. She brought him to the sally port near the old well that hadn't been used since King Theon Stark, 2 centuries dead, had decided that a different angle gave you the wind at your back. She brought him to the kitchens where the ovens went deep like the lungs of a baker god and asked pleasantly, "Would you like a tour?" She watched which of his men gulped when they smelled stew and which watched the maids too long and which counted the knives and which tried to stand where the door could not catch them unaware. She made a map of them in her head. She kept her hands folded. In the night, Arya slid out of the wall like a shadow the wall had learned. "They have the gatehouse, but only just," she whispered, breath warm against Sansa's ear. "The boy up there has hands that shake. Wex doesn't talk. He looks like he sees everything. There's a one-eyed man with a scar who knows doors." She pushed a scrap of leather into Sansa's palm, a chirurgeon's scribble of places, and Sansa closed her fingers around it and found that she could feel in her palm the bump where the ink had been laid on heavy. "And reek," Arya added, and spit into the rushes in a way that would have had Septa Mordane scrubbing her mouth with lye. "He smells worse than the tanner's yard." Sansa did not know the name as a name yet. The word slid cold inside her like a fish. She thought of men who talked with smiles and kept sharp things beneath them. "How many?" she asked. "Inside," Arya said, and ticked them off on her fingers without counting out loud. 18. No, 19. One sleeps in the harness room. He snores like a pig and dreams of tits. She had become adept at being a little older than she was meant to be, and there were times Sansa wanted to put her hands on either side of Arya's face and tell the world to stop. Just stop. For one day and let them breathe. Outside more. 2 hands of men. Maybe 3, less a finger. "We have summer," Sansa murmured. "We have Shaggy. We have men who would knife someone for calling them men. We have a wall that knows us. What we don't have," Arya said, "is time. If the ones at Torrens Square come back and find a kraken in their tub." That night, Sansa knelt in her chamber as if to pray and wrote a letter by shadows. The ink gleamed wet. She sanded it and blew and watched the letters fade down into a safer dullness. She did not sign it Sansa. She signed it with the shape her father had shown her once when they had pretended at spies in a wolf's den winter to amuse a little boy. A tiny, careful drawing of a weirwood leaf with the vein like a 7-pointed star. She tied it to a pigeon's leg. Ravens were a language that anyone listened to. Pigeons were unremarked. She let it go out Sansa's window into the night where the moon had gone thin. Howland Reed would read it if anyone did. If no one did, the letter would become some crow's bedding, and that was one fate for words in a world where worse befell them. The dawn after, Theon's men kicked open the armory's door and hauled a boy out by the scruff. Micken's apprentice had a stubborn set to his jaw even with his feet barely touching the ground. "Here's your gatekeeper," Drennan announced to the yard. His grin showed an empty place in his teeth which he had never bothered to have filled. Caught him trying to fetch his ma'am a kitchen knife. He fancy himself a hero. Kill him, Black Lauren said with the indifference of a man recommending that a bench be mended or not, as you like. No, Theon said, quick, and the yard felt something shift. We show mercy. He looked at Sansa then, as if to prove a point she had not intended to make. Winterfell will love me for it. Winterfell will not love you, Sansa said on the lowest breath. He did not hear it. It was for the stone. They brought Ser Roderick's head to the gate before they brought his body, and Sansa did not know what it cost her to stand. She had never been as proud of not crying as she was when she did not cry then. Theon had ridden out to meet Ser Roderick's little column in the market beyond the walls, had offered parley and then demanded surrender, and then found the old man at the center like a pillar in a storm and cut him down for his refusal, as if this were a story that needed a dramatic turn. When they set Ser Roderick's head on the spike, the mustache lifted in the breeze, and for a heartbeat it looked as if the old soldier were about to speak. Sansa pressed her nails into her palm until they made moons and said not one word, and later, when Theon looked over his shoulder as if to check that she had admired the firmness of his jaw, she let him see nothing. Arya did not make a sound, but for hours after the kitchen cats refused to come out from under the benches even for chopped bones. 3 nights later, the gatehouse boy put his shaking hands to better use and swung the winch while Arya's little knife lay against his throat, and the south postern door did. It was never used anymore except by lovers, and cats lost its bar and nobody heard it fall. The bog devils came on their bellies. Sansa did not see them until they were inside the yard, and then she could not see them for a different reason, because they did not show themselves until there was a throat to open or a rope to cut. Their spears made no sound in the air. They moved like the reeds, not against them. Wex Pike did not cry out when Mira slid her frog spear up through his ribs and caught his breath where it came easiest, which was a thing Sansa learned watching her and did not know she had learned until she knew it. The yard became a powder of motion. Sansa stood on the step below the dais again, outwardly the same picture, because the small folk had to see the same picture to believe that this time, too, would pass. Theon's men shouted in the wrong directions. Summer slashed through them like a gray blade. Shaggy bowled them over with an ugly joy. Theon bit at the air like a man who has lost his bit of rope and therefore cannot keep ends together. He had that handsome foolishness to him still, even splashed with someone else's blood. Sansa watched him bring his hand to his cheek and wipe at it in disbelief. He looked up at her then. He always looked at her when his mind stumbled, and in his eyes for the first time she saw the boy who had once tried to show Bran how to fire a child's bow as if patience were a showing off. And in the same glance she saw the man who would press his mouth against anything he could use and call it a kiss. Pity and something colder like contempt came into her in the same breath and made a strange alloy. It was hardly a battle. It was a cutting down. The Ironborn were sailors and reavers. Winterfell was stone and blood mixed and bled on its own ground by people rooted into it. The Crannogmen took backs like they were the soft underbellies of fish. Hot blood steamed on the snow. Hotter swung a staff and bellowed hotter, and laid a man with a striped beard flat. Mira's spear turned, caught, turned again. Arya's needle flashed and flashed. Black Lauren went down on one knee and then simply folded under the weight of his wrongness. The one-eyed man with the scar got as far as the well and then his feet found ice. He slipped and cracked his head, and that, Sansa thought, was an answer from the gods more honest than any prayer. Reek was the last to run. He did not run well. Sansa saw him slither among barrels and into the shadow by the old granary and vanish the way a bad smell does when a wind changes. "Let him go," Jojen said near her shoulder, and when she turned to him with incredulity sharp in her mouth, he shook his head once, looking not at her but at the air a little above her shoulder. "We will meet that one again," he said sadly. "Do not chase him where he runs best." Theon went to his knees as if he had been pushed. No one had pushed him. He dropped the sword in his hand. He looked up at Sansa, who had not moved all the while but to send boys with bandages where they needed to go. "Mercy," he said. The word was like the word a cat makes when the door finally opens. "Mercy, lady." "Sansa, I am not your enemy. I only—" He looked too many ways to finish the sentence. Sansa looked down at him and then past him to the men and women who watched her face. She could feel the weight of the decision like a cloak across her shoulders. "We are not killers by habit here," she said. "No man's justice is improved by throwing it in the fire to heat it. Bind him," she added to Mira, because Mira's eyes were cool and her hands sure. "Wash his mouth." She did not know why she said it. She regretted saying it at once. Mira did as she was told without a question. Theon coughed and gagged and spat blood and water. When he looked up again, there was a different shine in his eyes, less boyish. "We will send him to Robb," Sansa said. "Not for Theon's benefit, but for the Yard. Let the king in the north weigh him." They locked Theon in the little room between the armory and the smithy that had once been used for cooling blades slowly, when Mikken wanted a steel to remember its shape. It had no window and only a slit for air. Theon shivered. Sansa stood in the doorway and looked at him and made herself see both the boy who had laughed too loudly and the man whose laughter had paved the way for murder. Both were true. "Why?" she asked quietly. He found a grin and tried to put it on. It slid off his face like oil off water. "To be," he said. "To be something. To be someone. To make my father say my name without a sneer. To be more for once than a ward at a northern table." "You had a place," Sansa said. "You could have made it a good one." He bared his teeth. "At your feet?" he asked. "No," she said, and surprised herself with how sure she was. "At any man's back who deserved it. Beside any woman who knew your worth. At your own hearth if you had let it be your own. There's honor in small posts if men fill them full. There's shame in great ones if men wear them too loose." He sat back like he had been struck. For once he had nothing to say. Jojen, behind Sansa, rubbed the pad of his thumb against the sharp bone of his first finger. "We'll send word," Sansa said, mostly to herself. "We'll send it in 3 ways. One will be lost. One will be found where it will not do the most good. One will reach the right ear." She was learning the math of war, which is not numbers. It is margins. When the ravens went, they went heavy, and when the pigeon went, it went like any pigeon does, a blur against the gray. Sansa sat with Luwin and wrote again, this time with a hand that did not shake. "We have him," she said, and did not name him until the last line. "He lives. He will live until you tell me what use we can make of him." She added a line that was not hers, words Mira had suggested she put so that any man reading who loved his own life would hand the letter to the right lord. "E swamp walks," she wrote. "What you cannot see may still drown you." It was not until the next afternoon, when the yard had been cleaned and the dead laid out with coins on their eyes and a priest from the village sent for to say the words for the 7 for those who wanted them, and Sansa had knelt by the heart tree to whisper the names to the old gods for those who would not have the words, that Bran said the thing that turned the day again. "Rickon?" he said in a small, bewildered voice. "Where is Rickon?" They had thought him below with Osha, a wildling who had made a peace with Winterfell because she had eyes that had seen something worse than fences and liked fences afterward for the limits they set to fear. Luwin blinked, then frowned, and for the first time Sansa saw uncertainty move about his features like a cold wind searching for a seam in a wall. The search that followed spread through the castle like water into cracks. By supper time, Sansa had walked every passage she knew and had walked 3 she didn't and had looked in every chest large enough to hold a frightened boy. Rickon's little boots sat by the hearth in the chamber where he slept, one on its side as if a frustrated boy had kicked it off. Shaggy Dog was nowhere. Shaggy had always been nowhere unless he wanted to be. Theon laughed in his holding room when he heard the men muttering in the hall outside. It was a brittle sound. Sansa stood in front of him and looked as if she had heard nothing. Arya listened behind the door because she could not help herself. "You'll not find them," Theon said with a grin that tasted of salt. "You killed 2 boys and the wolves ate them, and now you can't tell which bones belong to which being. That is how the story goes." "We killed no boys," Sansa said. "We killed your men." He shrugged, smile wider. "Aye, but you will need a story. The Riverlands will want a story. The king in the north will want a story. So, 2 little lords ran and men caught them and the world burned for it. There, you can have my script." He leaned forward. "Or fetch me your maid sons, the ones with brown hair and fear in their eyes. Burn them. Burn them all the way black and raise them on spikes. Who will tell? Bones are bones. Ash is ash. Sansa looked at him until he looked away. There is a pit in you, she said, because he had told the truth to his own face and needed to be given the word. And you would fill it with anything, but it will never fill. He cursed then, mean, ugly little words that had no flow to them. Arya behind the door made a sound like an animal that wishes it were bigger than it is. Sansa put her hand on the door behind her back, flat, the way she had done with the heart tree once when she had wanted not to fall. Osha knows how to hide, she said, and this to herself. Shaggy knows how to hide. The world never looks where the wild looks first. She had once told Arya that monsters live under beds and that stepping down softly was a way to make them forget you were there. Now the monster was a man in a little stone room and the children under the bed were hers. Luwin found the trail 3 days later, not with eyes but with a guess about where a woman who understood wind would step and where she would not. In the old hunter's hut where the moss had claimed the bed frame, they found the heel print of a child's boot and a pile of pine cones stacked in a deliberate pattern only Rickon would have thought important enough to be a message. "I'm a prince," he said to anyone who would listen on days when he was not playing at being a bear. He had probably said it to Osha the moment they stepped out the postern. Sansa counted the cones twice and swallowed. 2 wolves, she said. 3 humans. It was all she needed. They did not burn any heads. They did not burn any boys. Sansa sent a raven to Robb with the cones drawn on the back of the letter, marked the way the cones had been, and wrote beneath them, Osha the brave, Hotter the strong, and a wolf the color of night. She put her seal to that and felt the air around the words change. "Let no man tell you different," she wrote in a hand her brother would know for hers. "Our little ones live." When Robb's reply came, it came from another world. "Gray wind howls when I read your words," he wrote in a long hand that had somehow grown narrower. "Jaime Lannister sits under guard. Lord Karstark looks at him like a starving man at bread. Mother is with me. She holds her chain of duty like it holds her. We cross the river with the phrase again. We keep our promises." He did not mention a girl's name he might have learned in a bed. He did not mention any bed. Sansa traced the word promises with her finger and felt relief and a hollowness she could not name. Promises save men and drown them in equal measure. You learn which only by keeping them. A few days after, a rider came to the gate in the dusk with a flag strapped to his back that looked like it had been pulled through mud. He called himself a Fry man, and his thoughts came streaming from his mouth with too much haste. "The Lord of the Crossing bids your lord brother come with his head bowed," the man said. "But not so low it makes him look like he begs. Lord Walder says he remembers the price he exacted, and the oaths he heard, and the slight he suffered, and the insult he did not suffer quite enough." The rider swallowed, eyes flicking to Sansa's face. "Lord Walder also says he will be paid twice over." He says this without smiling. Luwin rubbed his temples. "There are men in the world who count insult like coins," he said. "Then do not give them another," Sansa said. She looked at the rider, who had borrowed a horse too tall for him and had bruised thighs from it. "Tell Lord Walder his bridge is strong because it has stood through winters worse than this and men heavier than my brother. Tell him he can have his pageants and his pride if he will keep a promise. Tell him if he will not, the songs they sing about him will be shorter." She was amazed at her own boldness and then recognized it as the crispness that comes when you realize you are out of the bed and the floor is cold and you must decide whether to go back under the coverlet or commit to the cold. Arya, standing where she always found a shadow to keep her company, grinned with a kind of feral satisfaction. "And tell him," Sansa added, remembering something old Nan had once said about Walder Frey being older than salt and twice as dry, "that the North does not forget and it does not forgive so quickly as rivers do." The rider nodded as if she had given him courage with the words and let himself be given a bowl of stew and a bench near the fire before he rode on. Sansa watched him chewing and wondered at how much of a war was made of men like this, who carried words back and forth between places where those words became steel. They took Theon from his little cell for an hour in a day so bright it made the snow painful. They let him sit with his wrists bound in front of him and gave him a cup of beer and a piece of bread. He looked at the bread with an expression Sansa could not interpret and then ate it in 2 bites. "I dreamed the sea," he said, when he realized she would talk if he talked and would not talk otherwise. "I dreamed I was under it, and it pushed down on my chest, and it was like being a boy under my father's hand again. Only he smelled worse." "Do you remember?" Sansa asked. "The words of the old gods?" It had occurred to her that perhaps no one had ever said them where he could hear. He snorted beer. "A quaint thought." "They listen," Sansa said, "even to men who don't know how to talk to them. Even to men who have used their mouths for less." She found herself speaking like her mother then, which startled her. "You might put the right words into the air. They may settle somewhere you will never see. But air is full of seeds. If anything takes root, it might be in some heart you can't imagine." He looked at her with that look she had begun to name pity for the earnest. "You will be a good lady," he said, with a trace of mockery that could not hide a trace of truth, "if you survive all the men who want to test your goodness. A pity you were born where you were and not in a hall where men enjoy their wives' wisdom more than they fear it." "It is no pity," Sansa said calmly. "It is a history." When Jojen and Mira left Winterfell, it was with a quiet that told Sansa miles were heavy ahead. Bran kissed Sansa's cheek and let his lips linger there a breath longer than he would have done a year ago. He did the same for Arya. "I'll not be gone long," he said, trying out a man's lie on a sister who needed to hear it. Sansa smiled and gave him the courtesy of letting him see her believe him. Arya hugged him hard enough to make him grunt, then turned away quickly and pretended to scold Rickon for throwing a pine cone at Hodder's head. The little prince scowled. Hair too long, face so like their father's in the set of it that Sansa wanted to cry and didn't. Summer touched his nose to Bran's hand. Sansa held the image in her eyes, knowing it might be a long salt while before she had something as fine to hold again. "You'll go to a crow," Arya said to Bran under her breath, as if to convince herself it was a kind of jest. "You'll come back a tree. Don't forget how to walk." "I'll come back a boy," Bran said stubbornly. "Or better, come back alive," Sansa said, and put her hand on his hair and breathed in the smell of boy and oil and wolf, as if she could store it where grief could not find it. The bog boat slid out into the winter-dulled rushes with barely a sound. Sansa stood until the reed bed had swallowed it and kept standing after, because she would not be the first to turn away. The cold bit her cheeks, felt bracing, felt like an oath. Winterfell healed like a bruise, color moving from purple to green to an ugly yellow before the skin remembered itself. The walls remembered the Ironborn's boots and forgave them by habit, as old houses must or go mad. The kitchen stopped smelling of blood and went back to onions and barley and bread. The yard remembered the fall of men and of snow and made room for both. Theon's breath settled into the rhythm of a prisoner's. He began to speak less, as if his voice had discovered there are places it doesn't reach. A raven arrived with a piece of bright ribbon tied round its leg and words that smelled of from-the-hip promises and perfumed halls. "Lord Walder consents," it said, "on condition that the king in the north comes with his head covered as befits a man who respects an older man's sensitivities, and with his mother's mouth closed as befits a lady at another man's table." It went on, and Sansa caught the places where the old lord's sons had tempered his vinegar with their own fear, and she smiled once, small. "He will have his bride," it said. "He will have our bridge. He will not have our thanks for making us wait." There was no hint of red there, no scent of massacre in the ink. Perhaps, Sansa thought, that was because no massacre had yet decided itself where it needed to step over a threshold. Perhaps because Catelyn Tully had a look that made men choose the better road even when their feet ached for the wrong one. Perhaps because Robb Stark was learning in weeks what many men learn too late, that winning battles and keeping allies are not the same craft. Sansa and Arya walked sometimes in the village when the sky made blue a body you could breathe. Women curtsied, men touched caps, children ran in a pack in front of them and behind and made a game of being caught, then squealed and scattered. Arya taught a little boy with hair the color of sand how to make a sling out of a rag so he could knock icicles off the smithy roof without getting brained by one. Sansa slipped a sweetmeat she had tucked in her mitt into the hand of a girl whose mother Ad died the previous winter with a baby at her breast and no milk in her to feed it with. They were not queens, nor were they wardens, nor did they make speeches. They listened. They remembered names. They told the brewer's wife the proper name for that rash on her baby's cheek that Maester Lewin had told them over table and what to rub into it. And the rash went away, and the brewer's wife told 3 other women Sansa Stark's words had worked. "Your kindness is not a trick," Arya said to Sansa that night at the window. "Men will call it one. Let them eat those words." "It's not kindness," Sansa said, "meaning it and not meaning it. It is stonework. It is the way beams meet and hold weight. It is how to make a roof that doesn't fall when the snow stacks up." She did not say the other thing, which was simpler and much harder. "I want them to love me. I want to be worthy of it." Gendry left in the month when the snow took on that look that says it will stay until it decides otherwise and not a day less. He came to Sansa in the yard with his hat twisting in his hands and his hammer on his shoulder. "My lady," he began, and her smile made him blush and spit and start over. "Sansa," he said, "I should go." "You should," she said, which made it easier. "You will find a place where the hammer sings the song you were born to. Will you take my word for Winterfell? If you find someone who doubts we have letters that matter." He nodded, brightening. "Your word weighs more than my hammer," he said, and then looked embarrassed at having made what sounded to him like a foolish thing sound fine. I know what you mean," she said, and put her hand on his wrist because she could and because he would never mistake it. "Remember that your strength is not in your arms only," she added. "There are men who will want to hire you for your back as much as for your hands. Don't let them. Your hands are worth more." He blinked at that as if he had been told something he had never allowed himself to guess was true. He ducked his head and went. The yard watched him go with a fondness people feel for simple truths that have served them well. Sansa watched him until the gate swallowed him and hoped he would not go in circles long before he found a forge where a man who took pride in the honesty of the metal he made would say to a boy with arms like tree branches and eyes like river stones, "Yes, you can sleep here and we'll see what your hands can teach you." When news of the Blackwater came, it came with 2 stories flat out at war with one another and 3 more skulking around the edges trying to decide which men to attach themselves to. One said that wildfire had boiled the river and men had screamed like kettles with the lids clamped down. One said that a little man with a big scar had ridden through fire with an axe and that the city had chosen him for a heartbeat and then unchosen him after. One said that Stannis Baratheon had looked into the city and seen his crown hovering above it like a sweetmeat and then found that you cannot eat iron. They all agreed on one thing, that the Tyrell roses had come to sit beside the lions and that the stink of trampled flower would be soon enough on every road. Sansa read the letters, felt their truth pressing like snow against a door, and went to the Godswood, where she put her hands on the red bark and said her father's name again, and then her mother's, and then Robb's, and then her own. Arya threw a pebble into the pool and watched the ripples chase out to the edge and back again until they calmed. "Everything is changing," Arya said stubbornly. "It is," Sansa said, "and sometimes it changes into itself so slowly that you don't know it is the same thing but deeper." "Cryptic," Arya said, but without mockery. "You sound like Jojen when he's eaten too few turnips." "I sound like someone who is teaching herself to believe her own voice," Sansa said. That earned her a sidelong grin and a little shove. It felt like spring in the space between the shove and the smile, though there was no sign of it in the air. The rider from the twins came again. His horse blown and his face lined with anxiousness increased. He could not have been more than 25, and yet his worry made him the age of the roof beam in the great hall. He brought a sprig of rosemary wrapped in linen as if a token would make words easier to put in mouths. "The vows were said," he said, "and the bedding done, and Lord Walder smiled without showing his teeth, which is a trick I've never seen him do. He swallowed. Lord Edmure missed his sit on the privy in the morning, and men decided they were justified in being short with their words for an hour. But the bridge was opened and the banners rose, and nothing red fell except a girl's maidenhead and some wine. The old man squeezed his cup until the gold bent. He did not spill. He looked at Sansa as if this were a message she would know what to do with. It was good, Sansa said. Better. She let out a breath she had been holding without knowing. Somewhere far south, Caitlin Tully would have allowed herself one small smile that had no mirth in it, and then gone about arranging beds and meats and chairs as if the only way to make war behave was to keep a hall in order. None of it changed the shape of the thing moving down from the north that had nothing to do with Lannister gold or Tyrell roses. Sansa felt it the way she felt a storm well before it showed on the horizon. A heaviness in the air, a taste in the mouth like iron. Jojen had promised to send word when they reached the place where the world's skin thinned and old things pushed their fingers through from below. A raven came with a scrap of bark tied to its leg. The bark was from a white tree. On it, scratched with something sharp, were 3 lines. Boy beneath roots. Bird behind eyes. Cold ahead. It was very like Jojen to make a warning look like a riddle and very like Mira to find a way. To get a riddle to travel farther than sense often does. Sansa slept badly that night and woke with a certainty like pain before a rain. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was done. The war would slosh and change and throw men up on rocks for years. The world would shake itself and throw worse than men at them. There were days, this was one, when she wanted to be 12 again and to think that braids and pretty words could stop winter. Then there were days when she would not go back if she could, because going back would mean stepping away from the woman she could make herself. Roose Bolton came to Winterfell with a face so still the snow did not dare settle on his lashes. He arrived with a retinue that made the yard smell of cold leather and fox. His men were quiet in the way men are when they have been trained by a man who dislikes being given cause to proof his calm with blood. Sansa stood with Luwin and Arya to welcome him. It could not be helped. They needed his men at the neck to harry Lannister stragglers. They needed someone with a steady voice to tell the Riverlands that Stark attention would not fade as the nights lengthened. But Sansa felt Summer push his head hard against her hand when Roose crossed the yard, and she did not pretend the gesture meant nothing. "My lady," Roose said, looking at a point an inch above her left shoulder. "A great many words have come to me with your name in them." "Words travel farther than men," Sansa said pleasantly. "I hope the ones with my name on them were not offended by the weather." He inclined his head the soft degree required. His eyes were a color it would be impolite to name. "I had hoped to offer you help in your need," he said. He did not ask to see Theon. He did not ask, and his not asking was the asking. Sansa thought of Jojen's thumb rubbing the bone of his finger and the words the old gods put into the bark. She smiled as if at nothing more than a polite suggestion. "Our need is being met," she said. "We have bread. We have men enough to guard our own hearth. We have a kraken in a tankard waiting to be carried where he will be judged. We have wolves. What we do not have, my lord, is need for a man's hand in a matter we have already taken in ours." Roose's mouth made the shape of appreciation. "The North remembers," he said, as if testing a phrase to see if it had gone dull with use. He turned those pale eyes on Arya. "And grows teeth while it remembers, it seems." Arya set her jaw. "You do well not to put your hand between them." He laughed then, one soft puff of breath. "Loyalty will win this war," he said to Sansa, as if giving counsel to a child who has had the luck to say something true once. "And treachery will end it." He did not look toward Theon's little room, and so Sansa knew he had already measured it and the distance to the gate and the number of men he would need to take either one. They gave him hospitality and nothing else. He left with a careful salute and a piece of smoked elk wrapped in oiled cloth and a letter for Robb that could be read as courtesy or warning depending on what a man wanted. When he was gone, Sansa let out a breath and pressed her palm hard to her belly, where something had been tense since he rode in. "I do not like him," Arya said promptly. "He makes me feel as if my boots were not on." "You need not like him," Sansa said. "You need only to make sure your boots are laced and your knife is where you can find it without looking." "You sound like Mira now," Arya said grudgingly, and because she loved Mira that was praise. She went to check the straps on the little scabbard she wore at her hip and found that they were exactly as she had left them and then tightened them anyway. 2 days later, Theon tried to hang himself with his own belt. It was badly done, in the way of a man who has not thought through the mechanics of what his desperation requires. He went blue in the face and thrashed, and then the hook pulled loose and he landed with his head against the stone and lay there crying not from pain. Mira found him and cut the belt without a comment at all. Sansa came and looked at him and then at the slick of spit on his chin. "You have not earned an easy death," she said quietly, "and I have not earned the right to grant you one." He turned his face away. She had not known until that moment how much not hating a man could cost. She was there when Robb's men came. They rode in under a sky so clear the cold looked blue, banners hanging heavy. Gray wind came first, joy in the way his body moved, and Sansa's heart leapt up into her mouth and tumbled down again in the space of a breath. Robb swung out of his saddle and took her into his arms before she had arranged her face and rose. The new dairy girl looked away with a soft smile, and Arya made a show of rolling her eyes and then flung herself at her brother right after and almost knocked him over. He smelled of horse and leather and wood smoke and the little scent of oil on a good sword. "You look older," Sansa said into his collarbone. "So do you," he said. "So do we all." He pulled back and looked at her, at Arya, at the yard and at the men, counting in a way she recognized now that she counted. "Is it true?" he asked at last. He did not name what. Sansa nodded. "It is," she said. "He is here." They went to the little room between armory and smithy, and Robb stood in the doorway and looked at Theon. There was a weight to his silence that Sansa had not heard before. The boy who had once put mud in her hair and then cried when she cried had become a man who could stand and look and let looking be the punishment before the punishment. Theon's eyes darted over his face like fish in a bucket. "Mercy," Theon said, because it had become his word. "Robb, King, mercy." Robb stared at him until Theon fell quiet, which did not take long. "You put our home to the torch?" he asked. "No, you did not. Because my sisters and the marsh watched the walls and the wolves were not chained." He seemed to taste the words as he said them. "You killed a good man," he said in that same almost quiet. "You killed Ser Roderick in the yard like a coward. You tried to frighten Winterfell with the bones of boys who were not your enemies." He let his breath out. "You think I will make this easy on you," he said. It was not a question. Theon did not answer. "You will go south under guard," Robb said. "You will be seen chained and without dignity. You will be shown to every man whose house you raided and told to say the words my maester will write. You will kneel before Lord Balon's seat in whatever hall he holds, and you will ask your father to learn the meaning of the word son, or you will see what it is for a kraken to dry out on a rock. Then," he paused, "then I will decide what a king in the north does with flotsam." Theon swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing like a trapped thing. Robb turned away. "I will sit in our hall," he said to Sansa and to Arya, and they walked with him, one to each side. Gray wind paced ahead, shaking snow from his coat. They ate together that night. Robb called for meat and for bread and for the little cakes Sansa had shown the cook to make with honey pressed in their centers, because they make a man remember a home he cannot find in wartime. He spoke of battles as if they were chores that had to be done, and that he had done as cleanly as he could. He spoke of men as if they were tools that had hands and could therefore decide for themselves if they wanted to be misused. He spoke of their mother with his voice going smaller and steadier, proud and frightened for her in equal measure. He spoke of a girl whose hair he had seen under a veil and whose eyes had looked at him without the calculation of a lord's daughter thinking of what a king could get her. No name given, and Sansa felt relief pool in her like warm water, and he spoke of a bridge that had held, and of Lord Walder's face when he had realized he was going to hold onto his grudges for a few more years yet, and of how, in the end, even a fry will must bow to the weight of a king's need if the held hand is made to look like a coin you will spend later on him. After, when the hall had emptied and the wolves lay heavy and silent near the dais and the last log moved and collapsed into itself in the hearth, Sansa sat with Robb and Arya and Luwin, and nothing but breath made sound. "We will have to be cruel," Robb said, and the words cost him. "Sometimes. Or stern." He looked at Sansa. "You were stern when you had to be." "I was not cruel," Sansa said. "It would have made me smaller." "There will be times," Robb said when she did not speak into his pause, "when it makes you larger." There will be times when men will call the stern cruelty because they do not get what they want. You must know which times are which. You will know." He looked at Arya then, and his mouth softened, and in the softness Sansa saw the boy she had adored and tortured and adored again. "And you," he said to Arya, mock severity barely holding, "must stop being 3 children in a small wolf's skin." "Why?" Arya asked, as if he'd told her to stop breathing. "It's useful." "It is," Robb agreed, laugh sneaking through. "Just don't let anyone count how many knives you are carrying at any given moment." He sobered. "I will go south again," he said, "and I will leave Winterfell to you. I cannot split myself and be a good king." He put his hand on Sansa's and then on Arya's. "Hold our home," he said. "Make it hold itself. Make it so that when winter settles, men feel the floor under their boots and know it is not going anywhere." "We will," Sansa said. "We will," Arya said, and then added, "And I will find the one called Reek and put my knife in him." "Leave me one piece of him," Robb said wearily, "for the law. The rest is yours." Sleep came to Sansa like a blanket thrown over a fire. She dreamed of the heart tree. She dreamed of wolves moving through snow without a trace. She dreamed of a boy under roots and a bird behind eyes and cold ahead, and felt fear and did not let it turn into panic. She woke before dawn and put her cloak around her shoulders and went to the kitchens. The bread had risen. The air was warm. The women looked up and nodded to her, and she took the wooden shovel and slid it under the loaves and brought them out and set them in a row. She broke one and steam came out like a ghost leaving gladly. She tore a piece off and poured honey into it and took it to Arya sleeping in the chair by the fire where she had fallen asleep talking to Grey Wind, and put the sweet piece of bread into her sister's hand. Arya woke and ate without opening her eyes. Sansa stood and looked at the window where dawn made a gray square and thought, "We have done this much. It is not enough. It is everything." On the day Robb rode south again, the snow returned in fine, persistent flakes, like ash without the guilt of fire. The banners rose. Men slapped each other's backs and then kept their hands on shoulders a moment longer than they needed to. Sansa kissed her brother's cheek hard enough to make him blink. Arya punched his arm and then hugged him until his ribs creaked. Luwin stood with his hands folded and his chin lifted and his eyes damp and his mouth firm. When the gate swallowed the last banner, Sansa stood on the wall and let the cold sting her. "Would you go south if he asked you?" Arya said suddenly. "Once I would have told him yes at once," Sansa said. "Now I would ask him 100 questions first." She thought of King's Landing and of the way the city had fed on itself when the wind changed. "I will not go back there unless we need something so badly it cannot be gotten any other way." "What could we need that badly?" Arya demanded. "Peace," Sansa said. Felt like a joke and not a joke. "Or a friend. Or a voice to speak for us in a room where our name has been turned upside down in shack. Or a man's head whose neck is too thick for anyone else's sword." Arya grinned. "That last one I could get you," she said. Then she sobered. "Sansa? When the cold comes." "It is here," Sansa said. "It may not be the worst of it, but it is here." Arya put her hand in Sansa's. Sansa squeezed, and their hands made a small, strong shape against the cold. Wolves howled far off, and the sound ran along the stone like wine down a throat. Someone somewhere, perhaps a boy with arms like branches, perhaps a girl with a spear, perhaps a man whose hands had learned a better craft than killing, lifted his head and smiled without knowing why. Winterfell waited for winter the way old houses do, with work. Sansa made lists and crossed them. Arya counted knives and made sure they were sharp. Luwin read aloud at supper the letters he could that would not turn men's bellies. He kept back the ones that would. The heart tree watched. The snow came and went and came to stay. Somewhere under roots a boy practiced being a bird and learned how not to drown in the air. Somewhere under a different roof a man with pale eyes sharpened the knives he had named loyalty and treachery and waited for the moment when using either one would suit him. Somewhere on a gray sea, a father who had not learned the word son set his head between his shoulders and felt the gods he had chosen to be more comfortable with him than his own children did. And in the north, In the stone halls where wolves lay heavy and breathed the breath of cold animals who know the rules winter enforces, two sisters kept their house. They kept it hard and they kept it well. They learned when to be kind and when to be stern and when to be neither but simply there, like the beam in the roof when a storm sets in. They told the names of their dead to bark and to snow. They learned the taste of patience and did not starve on it. They waited for the next thing to break because the world had told them clearly there would be a next thing, and they made ready. When they smiled, the smiles were not the smiles they had brought south with them the first time. They were better. They were true. They were the kind of smiles you keep with your teeth when the wind picks up. And the wind was picking up.